Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's In the Know Live. We are going to be covering the new overtime rules that are going into effect here in just a few weeks. This is going to greatly impact our churches, and there are still so many questions out there and so much confusion. So today we are going to be talking with Art Rhodes. He has done a tremendous amount of research on this topic and going to try to help clarify some of these issues for us. And we have already had many questions come in today in advance of our webinar, so we're going to cover as many as we possibly can, but may not be able to get to them all, and we may even go over for just a couple of minutes. So hopefully you can join us and stay with us through the whole thing. Again, we will try to get to as many as we can, so let's just go ahead and get started. Art, thank you so much for joining us today and helping us with this issue.
It's great to be here. This is a very tough and confusing issue, but hopefully we'll be able to bring a little bit of clarity with the questions today. So thank you for being here with me today to guide me through this process and keep me on track, hopefully.
I'll try. That's a tough job, but let's just jump right in. Are you ready to get started?
Let's do it.
All right. Our first question is perfect for a beginning question to this conversation. What exactly do the new overtime rules state, and to who do they apply?
Well, goodness, I think we have to, that gives us the opportunity to kind of go back and look at the start of this whole issue. And you have to go back a long time before I was born, 1938. So, and that was an eternity before you were born, I'm sure. But in 1938, Congress passed what is known as the Fair Labor Standards Act. And in the Fair Labor Standards Act, it basically had a minimum wage. And so a lot of people refer to this as the FLSA, or Fair Labor Standards Act, or they refer to it as the wage and hour laws, and it's all the same thing. But as a part of the wage and hour laws, there is a provision that basically says that certain people can be exempt or non-exempt from those particular laws. Now, everybody has to abide by the federal minimum wage. Mm-hmm. And there's a couple of provisions of coverage that mandates this coverage. And we're not going to get into the weeds and all this, but there's something called enterprise coverage, which covers the entity, and then there's individual coverage. And in this environment that we live in today, where there is any type of interstate commerce, everybody is going to be covered primarily under that individual coverage. The enterprise coverage generally does not apply to churches, but the individual coverage does. So the Fair Labor Standards Act applies to individuals that work for churches, applies to everybody basically now in this environment. So I've got a couple of slides to kind of follow up on this question here and just kind of talk about the old rules, and then we'll look at a new rule. So again, basically there's exempt employees, there's non-exempt employees. An exempt employee is someone that is on a salary. They fall under really three tests. So number one, they have to be on a salary. Number two, they have to receive a certain amount of money. Now that's what you see on the screen that up until now has been $455 per week, or $23,000, a little over $23,000 a year. So have to be on a salary, have to receive at least that minimum salary level. And then third, there's a duties test. And that duties test is they have to be either administrative, executive, or professional. And all of those different things have a criteria of what it means. So if you are an executive person, you are supervising two people and other things. So, but you have to be more than just, I don't want to say just more than a secretary, because secretaries make our lives run, but it has to be more than just a base employee. It has to be someone more in management. So again, three things. You have to be on a salary, you have to make that minimum salary level, and you have to be executive, administrative, or professional. So then if we look at the new rules maintain two of those three things, well, they maintain really all three of them. It just changes the salary level. So you still have to be on salary, but now the salary has to be better than double what the old rule was. And that amount has to be at least $913 per week. So that's almost $23 an hour.
Goodness.
And or $47,476 a year. But you still have to be executive, administrative, or professional. So that's a lot of talking, but the basic rule here is under the new regulation, still have to be on salary. You have to be an executive, administrative, professional person, and you have to make more than the $913 a week to be exempt from the overtime rules. So if you could be an executive employee and making $40,000 a year, and you are still subject to the overtime rules, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So you have to meet all three of those to be possibly exempt. Mm-hmm. So that brings us to this whole discussion of goodness. And I know you're trying to ask another question.
So many questions.
Okay.
The next one that has come in is, when do these changes take effect? Is this retroactive back? When does it go?
Well, the rules say that it takes effect on December 1 of this year. So we're just a few days away from that.
Very good. Well, what is the required overtime pay? Is it time and a half of the person's regular hourly wage? Is it twice their regular pay? Or is the overtime based on minimum wage?
Well, the minimum wage now is $7.25 nationally. And I want to make sure that I point this out at this point. Some states have different minimum wage requirements. And if your state has a greater minimum wage than the $7.25 an hour, you have to obey that rule. A state cannot make it less than $7.25, but they can make it greater. And in some areas, it's $15.
Oh,
so
I want to go there.
You might get a raise.
Right.
But the issue is you have to obey that number in the state. But this rule applies regardless of what the number is. So the basic for the overtime pay is, it is time and a half is what is required under the law. So let me just give a simple example. If you're making $10 an hour and you're working 40 hours a week, if my math is correct, that's about $400 a week.
Correct.
So if you work more than 40 hours in the week, you are to be paid time and a half, not double time, not double the minimum wage or time and a half of the minimum wage. You are to be paid time and a half of your $10 an hour. So you're to make $15 an hour. And again, using that simple example, that person that's making $10 an hour may be an executive employee or may be an administrative employee and meet that part of the test, but they don't meet the minimum salary level test.
Very good. Well, the next question is, if a church passes a resolution forbidding overtime more than 40 hours a week, will that cover the church under these regulations?
Well, this question has come up multiple times, and I've seen churches say, and I've talked with churches, and they've said, I don't guess you talk to a church, you talk to church staff people.
Right.
Church staff people have said, we're going to just pass a regulation or a rule, or the council of our church is going to pass a provision that says we're not going to allow overtime. And you can certainly do that. However, just because you say that you're not supposed to do it does not mean that it doesn't happen. So all of a sudden now you've got a church janitor, for instance. Don't pick on church secretaries because they make churches run, but I guess church janitors do as well. But let's say you have a church janitor who has worked 40 hours in the week, and all of a sudden we've got a revival, or we've got a youth event, or we've got something else, and now they are working an extra 8 or 10 hours that week, and they are not making more than that minimum salary level. you've got to pay them overtime in that situation. So while the church may pass that resolution and say you're not supposed to do it, if it happens, you still have to pay them. You can have all the resolutions in the world.
Okay. My understanding is the provision does not apply to ministers, but should it? And would a pastor and associate pastor's total compensation package be considered in the salary levels?
Well, you know, this question has to come from a non-minister, because they feel like ministers all be treated just like they are. And let me just say, this is a wonderful question because there is not a perfect answer for this. Under previous court decisions, under the earlier rule, and under Department of Labor regulations that have enforced the lower salary level, there has been what is known as a ministerial exemption, basically saying that ministers, regardless of how much they are paid, do not fall under the Fair Labor Standards Act and are not subject to overtime pay and those things. Now, the person asked, should they? You know, I guess that's a philosophical question, and I'm not going to go there. But, you know, the question is, if they were to be considered, what would apply? Would housing, would expense reimbursement, those kind of things? You know, we can go through that and say probably expense reimbursement wouldn't count. Housing, would it count? You know, we don't know. But this is the regulations from 2005. A couple of court cases say it does not apply to ministers. However, the new regulations clearly say on the very first page of this multi-page document, clearly says there's no exceptions. But we have this ministerial exemption that has applied for multiple years. Most lawyers who practice in this area, in the employment area, believe that that ministerial exemption is going to continue to apply, even though it says that it doesn't. Even though it says there's no exemptions, we still think there is a ministerial exemption.
Do we think clarification will come at some point?
Probably not. But anyway.
So we just use our best judgment.
We use our best judgment. There may be some litigation at some point to try to clear that up. But it says there's no exceptions. We still think, though, there are.
Okay. Well, our next question says, what criteria does the FLSA use to evaluate, and who is considered a minister? You may want to start by reminding them what FLSA is.
Well, now you've got me having a hard time.
Yes, yeah.
FSLA is the Fair Labor Standards Act, and the question is, and that's the overtime law. And again, we just talked about ministers, so I guess this follow-up question is pretty much, well, who is a minister and who is not covered by the law? And there are a variety of court cases over the last several years that say who is a minister, who is not a minister. The simplest and the easiest way to think about who's a minister and who is not is to just apply the same rules that you would use to determine who's eligible for a housing allowance, for a ministerial housing allowance. So number one, the person certainly must have ministerial credentials. They must be in a ministerial capacity. They must be held out by the church as a minister. They must be performing ministerial duties. Each court that has taken this up has in some way addressed different facets of that. But basically, the simple rule would be to say anybody that is eligible for the housing allowance is probably going to be covered under the ministerial exemption. So that's a simple way. Could there be additional factors added by a court? Absolutely. But for right now, I would say that would be the way I would suggest determining if this person's a minister. Now, let's just for a second there before we go on, and I know you want to move to the other questions, but what if you had a person, for instance, who is a children's pastor who doesn't have ministerial credentials? Number one, they're not eligible for a housing allowance.
Right.
And number two, they probably are subject to the overtime rules. So if they don't make more than the $47,000 now, as of December 1, which more than likely they may not unless they're at a rather large church, then if they work more than 40 hours in the week, they've got to be paid overtime, even though they may be called a pastor.
And that may be their primary source of income.
And that may be their primary source of income.
Okay. Well, let's talk about some of our administrative staff. This question says, if our administrative assistant works more than 40 hours a week, can we offer compensatory time to average out the overtime hours from that week?
Well, the answer is yes and no. Is that a good lawyer answer?
That's a great answer.
Okay. The answer is compensatory time that is offered within the same regular pay period within that week, within that same regular pay period, can be used. So, for instance, let's just say we have a normal Monday through Sunday work week. I guess that's a normal week. And a person works 5 days of the week, so Monday through Friday, and they're working 8 hours a day, they're getting in 40 hours in the week. If, for instance, this administrative assistant in the question works an extra 2 hours on Monday, then you could certainly sometimes in the rest of that week give that administrative assistant 2 hours off. It doesn't have to come all together. You could give 1 hour off one day, 1 hour another day. But as long as they're still within the 40 hours for the week, we're good. The problem is you can't build that compensatory time up and say, hey, we're going to give you comp time. You worked an extra 2 hours this week, and I know you're going to go on vacation in a month from now. We'll just add up all your comp time and give you an extra day off. Can't do that. It has to be within the pay period. Now, if your pay period is not Monday through Sunday, then it works that pay period. So if your pay period starts on Tuesday or Thursday or whatever, it's from that day until the end of that week.
Okay, very good. Okay, our church is involved in several big conferences each year. Can our employees just volunteer to work additional hours during those times and us not have to worry about paying them overtime? Now, church people are great at volunteering. That sounds like a wonderful question.
Well, that sounds like a wonderful solution too, doesn't it?
It does.
So I guess the example would be if I used the janitor earlier, the janitor could say, we're in revival this whole week. I'm working my 40 hours, but I'm going to stay every night and make sure the church is clean after the revival service and work another extra hour or two. That would be really nice if you could do that. However, the law says you can't do it. And this is and you have to be really cautious here. A person, an employee, cannot volunteer to do their same job. So you can't be an employee and a volunteer for the same job.
Okay.
Now, so the janitor can't volunteer to do janitorial work above and beyond his 40 hours. What about the situation, and I've been asked this on multiple occasions, what about our church secretary who works 40 hours a week and then volunteers on Sunday to work in the nursery?
Right.
Is that additional time worked? Well, if it's me having to work with children, it would be a lot of additional time, and I'd probably need to be paid 3 or 4 times. But I think that's a scary situation there. It is a different job, and certainly that person should be allowed to volunteer for a different job. But I think if it becomes an expectation of her employment that you're going to volunteer, then you've crossed the line, even though it's totally different. So in situations like that, I've just encouraged people to just stay away from those situations. So if the church secretary in that example is going to work an additional 3 or 4 hours on Sunday, then she probably should be on a 36-hour week and then make sure that she gets paid for 40 hours.
Okay, that sounds like the safe bet. Our next question is it possible for the church to tweak hours during peak times of the year to avoid paying overtime? That tweaking is an interesting word.
I think before you said that was you used financial terms, and tweaking is kind of a good legal term, I guess, here. Can you tweak? Again, I am always amazed at church folks because they can come up with a perfect scenario to kind of get past the law. And this sounds to me like one of those situations. I would be very cautious about tweaking anything, okay? But let's just say in this situation, I am interpreting this question to say, well, what if a person works 40 hours, or let's say 50 hours this week, and because it's a peak time, we're involved in some youth conference or revival or something of that nature. And so next week, they work 50 hours this week. Next week, we're going to let them work 30 hours. Can you do that? If I read into this question what the person is asking, the answer to that is no. You can't do it. Again, it's got to be within the week. Whenever that week starts, whenever it finishes, if that person works more than 40 hours a week, they have to be compensated time and a half. So if you tweak, again, giving them the credit of the benefit of the doubt here, if they tweak the time within the week, it's back to the earlier example. You worked extra 2 hours today, then you could take an extra hour off tomorrow or 2 hours off till you make up that time. As long as the tweaking occurs in that week, we're probably good. Can't average those weeks out.
You can't tweak over the whole year. You've
You
got to
can't,
tweak
no.
in that pay period.
You can't tweak over the whole year. You can't tweak over 2 weeks. It's got to be within the pay period.
Okay. Well, our next question, how should churches prepare for these new rules and regulations? That is a good question.
It's a great question, and it's actually one that is addressed in the regulations. And I almost found this comical as I read the regulations, because the first thing that they suggest in the regulations is to solve this overtime issue, you just raise everybody's pay to $47,476.
Your employees would like that a lot.
The employees would love that. But that is their first suggestion. And again, in our world, in the church world, that's just not possible in most situations. Now, you may have someone that's at $45,000 that is working 50, 60 hours a week, and it's worth it to raise them to that level so you can now exempt them from the overtime requirements. You may have somebody even at $40,000 that makes it more economical to raise them over that level so you can exempt them from the rules. However, a person making $25,000 is not going, you can't raise them that much. So they suggest, number one, raising the salary. Again, assuming that's not possible. The other situation is just, the simple way is just making everybody an hourly employee and saying, you're going to work 40 hours a week, and if you work over that, we're going to pay you time and a half. Now, you have to realize that a lot of people have been, quote, salary employees, and they like not having to punch a time clock. They like not having to keep up with their time. And they're making $30,000, and they've been under the old regulation. Everything was fine. Now they're way under. And you're going to say to this salary employee, we're going to have to put you on an hourly rate. That's the simplest way to deal with it, though, is just say, you know what, instead of making X number of dollars, you're now up for a salary, you're now making X number of dollars per hour. And we're going to calculate those hours. We're going to keep up with the time that you work, and we're going to pay you for over 40 hours. Now, again, there are some of those folks, and another way to deal with it is one of the questions that you asked earlier. Can we just implement a rule that says you can't work over 40 hours a week? That's a great tweak, to use your previous term. It's a great tweak to deal with this. But if they should work, you've got to pay them.
Okay, well, in some cases, that could really benefit the employee. They may get quite the raise just from their time worked.
They could very well get a raise just from their time worked. There's been an interesting discussion just from if we look at the public standpoint, a lot of people didn't realize this, but Secret Service agents that guard the president and the president-elect now are capped at how much they can make. So when they get to the point that that salary level is capped, this is just trivial knowledge, has nothing to do with this. But when they get to that cap, they can't make any more, but they have to keep on working. Now, there's been a lawsuit filed on that we're being required to work and not getting paid for it. So hopefully that doesn't happen in the church world, and that has absolutely nothing to do with it.
It is interesting. Okay, our next participant wants to know if our church fails to comply with these new regulations, whether voluntarily or accidentally, what types of penalties might we face?
Well, there are both monetary penalties. There's a requirement to pay back the wages that were not paid. And there are actually criminal penalties if you blatantly just disregarded the law. So that's why it's so important in the church world for us to realize that you can't just say we're not going to follow these new rules, because the criminal penalties start out at like $10,000 fine. And the base civil penalty under the rule is, for the first violation, is like $1,800 plus the back wages. Wow. But you got to remember something else. That is that insurance coverage does not apply to the Fair Labor Standards Act. So you can't call on your insurance company and say, oh, by the way, we had an error here and we didn't pay this person under the overtime rules. The insurance company is going to say, God bless you, you're on your own. Then you've got to have legal counsel and everything else to help you through this process. So it could be very, very costly.
Okay. Well, by changing the title of an employee, does that make them exempt?
Well, and that's, a lot of people have said, well, we're just going to change the title, make them an executive employee. And so, no.
No.
You can call the person whatever you want to, but it goes back to that 3 tests. They have to be on salary, they have to be an executive, administrative, or professional employee, and they have to make more than the $47,476. You could call them whatever, but if they don't meet those 3 tests, it's not going to make a difference as to whether or not the overtime rules apply to them.
Right. And their title is determined not by just what you call them. Even maybe they meet the salary requirement and the other requirement, but their title is different. You can't just change it because there are certain guidelines, correct? That give you that title of executive administrator.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, you have to. You could call them that, but to be an executive employee, you have to supervise at least 2 people. You have to be able to. You are participating in the hiring and firing of those people. So there's some requirements just to be an executive employee or to be an administrative employee or a professional. So just because you say, this is my executive secretary, does not make them executive under that rule.
That helps clarify. Okay, what about flex time? Can flex time be applied to non-exempt employees?
You know, I think that's probably basically the same question that we got earlier, where you were talking about tweaking their time. Can that flex time be applied? Yes, it can, as long as it's within that pay period. So again, you can move around and say you're going to have to work 10 hours today. Tomorrow you only have to work 8, as long as it is within the same pay period.
Okay. And our next question brings in a whole new dimension.
Sure.
Are preschools or daycare teachers who work for the church exempt?
Well, there are some exemptions under the law, and teachers are exempt.
Okay.
Now, I want to just make sure that you hear me and everybody hears me. A teacher is a teacher. A daycare worker that is not a teacher and spends more of their time just providing for the care of children is probably not going to fall under the teacher exception. So if you have a daycare, if you have a school, you need to get good legal counsel to tell you who can be exempt and who is not exempt. But if you're a teacher, you don't have to make the $47,000. You could be making $30,000 a year. And we see a lot of coaches and other things in high schools. They can be exempt from these overtime rules, meaning that they're making $40,000 or $30,000 a year, and they can work 60 hours a week, and you don't have to pay them overtime. But you better make sure that you've qualified those folks in the right way. And so legal counsel is really critical to make sure that you know who's doing what. So you may have a preschool teacher, that's what you call her. But if she spends more time caring for the children than teaching the children, she may not qualify under this exemption.
Okay, our next question is, what options do we have as a church to conform to the new regulations?
Again, I think that's probably very similar to the same question we got a while ago. Raise their salary. The Department of Labor says raise their salary to $47,000, prohibit overtime, hire part-time workers to take care of the overtime work, a bunch of different ways to do it, but I think it's the same question as earlier.
And what criteria other than salary does an employee have to meet to be considered exempt? We've talked about this as well in previous questions.
We have, again, other than salary, other than the $47,000, they have to be administrative, executive, or professional. I'll keep saying that over and over. And they have to be on a salary. So salary, minimum salary level, and then you have to be one of those three criteria.
Okay. How does the new law affect part-time employees?
It does apply to part-time employees because people say, well, we don't ever have to worry about that because this is a part-time worker and they're only working 10 weeks out of the year and we're going to just work them like a slave during that period of time. You can't do that. Part-time workers, even young people that are working, there's some whole different regulations that apply to those that are under 18, and particularly those that are younger than that, 15, 16-year-olds, about when they can work and times they can work and all. But a part-time worker, if that worker works more than 40 hours in a week, now their pay may be such that if they work the full year, would put them over the 47,000. But if they're not working the full year, you don't get to accumulate those times. So it's got to be based upon how much time they work in the year, and if they work more than 40 hours in a week, they got to be paid overtime.
Okay. And now we've come to another pretty good question. It says, if we have an employee that is salaried at $500 a week, do I have to increase their salary to $913 a week? Or do I pay the employee $12.50 per hour, which is $500 a week, and add overtime to the employee who works over 40 hours a week and pay time and a half?
Yes.
Okay.
Simple answer.
Yeah. Which we've kind of talked about that as well.
We have. Again, the $500 employee would like to make the $913, and I'm sure that if you raise their salary to that level, they would greatly appreciate it, probably hug you, send you a Christmas card. But if they are not working, they've been eligible for being exempt, but now they are not will not be after December 1 under the new rules. So you would just basically pay them at the hourly rate, and then for any rate or any hours worked over 40, you would pay them time and a half. And I know we're running out of time, so we're already past our time. So I'll try to be quicker. Go ahead.
We'll go quickly. If our pay week runs from Wednesday to Tuesday and an employee works for 5 additional hours on Friday, can I compensate them by letting them leave 5 hours early on Monday?
On the next Monday, you can. You can't 2 weeks from Monday. It's got to be within that pay period.
Same pay period.
So,
that pay period dominates.
Right, and we've talked about that. It doesn't matter when your pay period is. It's not a standard Monday through Sunday pay week. If your pay week, in this case, Wednesday through Tuesday, then it has to be within that Wednesday through Tuesday schedule. And in this case, yes, you can let them take off 5 hours on Monday and you would be good.
Okay. Do we need to install a time clock to keep up with hours worked now? Is that mandated by this regulation?
It is not mandated to have a time clock. However, it is mandated under the law. It has always been mandated that you must keep records of the hours worked by employees. And so some people say, well, am I going to have to go get one of those time clocks, put it up on the wall, and I punch the card and all that, and that's demeaning to my employees, and I don't want to do that. No, those time clocks they're nice for movies, and they're nice for that little cartoon character, where he
Right.
checks in and chases the fox or whatever all the time. That's really good for that kind of stuff. But now there are all kind of time clocks that are available for computer systems, and a lot of those are free. We actually use one here at the Benefits Board that is free. So if you got up to 10 employees, you can get this system and use it for free. There are a lot of those out there. I would encourage you to just do a search, but you do need to make sure that you got records of how long each person worked each day. And that goes along with their personnel files, and you need to be able to track that.
And I have heard that there are several court decisions challenging these new overtime regulations, and that our newly elected president doesn't like them either. Do you think the courts or the president might change these new rules?
Well, again, we delayed this webinar on this topic till today, anticipating that a court, particularly there's a court in Texas that has been hearing this case, that these regulations are unfair and were implemented not in a normal course of administrative implementation of rules and regulations. We had anticipated that there would be a decision on that by today. There has not been, and so we still wait. However, the new president has said that there's a lot of these regulations he's going to readdress. However, we are proceeding as though they are going to be fully in effect forever, because even if our new president decides to overrule them or to overturn them, they will have been in effect for about 60 days almost by the time he takes office, because remember, they do take effect December 1. So they're going into effect then, unless a court stops. We don't really see that happening, but
we can hope.
We can hope.
Okay.
We can hope.
All right. Well, that wraps up our time and our questions. Actually, we're well over time, as you've already mentioned, but thank you so much. You have really helped answer a lot of questions that I know our ministers and churches have, and really appreciate you taking time to talk with us today.
Well, you'll see a slide come up that gives you our website at benefitsboard.com. I would encourage you to visit our website. We do have a white paper on there. So if you go to our website, click on resources, and then just go down to forms. On the very top of those forms, you will see a document, a couple-page document on the overtime rules that gives the basic rules. I thank you for joining us today. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. And I know that this is a tough issue, but hopefully the information we provided today will be helpful. And we'll look forward to seeing you next time. You want to tell them when we'll be back?
Yes, we have our next webinar scheduled for Thursday, December the 15th at 2 o'clock Eastern Time. And on that one, we are going to cover year-end financial issues that are facing our church. So we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you, and God bless you. Hope you have a wonderful Thanksgiving season.